I am very pleased and very happy and thrilled to introduce my former colleague, Eddie Downs, to you tonight.
This is great to be here. Thank you for letting me come here to Lasell. Dr. Barrett has been my mentor and my friend and my confidant. And recently she said, Eddie, get going on the book. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And Dr. J-Mac, thank you so much for inviting me. This is a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Lasell is lucky to have you. And I know that you had written a book not too long ago, so congratulations. I always joke about Dr. Barrett because I went to a small undergraduate school called St. Bonaventure. The standards were moderately high. And what I tell my students is, well, you know, people who get rejected from St. Bonaventure have to go to Harvard instead. So that's the big joke, and that's what Janice actually did at work. So this is very good. I want to share with you, I wish we would do more of this. There's 3 of my students who I brought along, and they all assist me in different ways here in my work at the college. On my far left is Molly. You can say hi. And in the middle is Cecilia. And to the right, to the left of mine, to the right is Lou. They're all public relations graduate students, and Molly on the far left and Lou on the far right also are interested in international issues and international. So that's their expertise. So all of them have read the book and they've all helped me. But the real star of the evening tonight is Lou, because she actually put together the PowerPoint presentation. So she's done that.
All right, good.
So let's just have some fun. We'll have some fun over the next 45 minutes, 50 minutes. Hi, guys. Hi. We'll have some fun over the next 45 or 50 minutes. We can talk a little bit about what's going on and share a little bit about the book with you. I think it'll be interesting for you. I hope it is. It's very interesting for me. There's about 20 different data sets that I've collected over the years. And each of these data sets is reflected in the work that I'm going to share with you tonight. So let me just share with you. It might be fun if what I'm worried about is if we shut off the light and we fall asleep. But we have some good Saudi coffee. So if you feel sleepy, so maybe you can shut off the light for me. If this is okay? Is this okay? We'll see how that works. So we'll give this a shot. This is great fun to be here again. Thanks so much. This is sort of an iconic American image. This is the image of our Capitol building in Washington, D.C. If you take out a U.S. nickel coin, you'll see that this is in fact the picture that's on that nickel coin. Now something very, very interesting happens in this building, and that is that the laws that influence your life and mine are decided here. Later in the evening, we're going to talk about the Affordable Health Care Act, talk about Obamacare, and the question there is, that may influence our citizens, folks here, and to some degree, it was decided on right here. Are we going to give more money to agricultural programs? What are we going to do about gay rights? What about cutting edge issues, ranging from abortion to gay marriage? What about some of the financial issues, the budgetary issues? All of the laws that impact you and impact me and impact everyone here come to fruition under that dome. Now, I will tell you that one of the things that the people I studied, and I'll tell you more about them in just a minute, one of the things that was so interesting about them is they loved to reflect. They would tell me stories. They would say, I leave my office and I see the dome. Just a show of hands, who's been to Washington and actually seen just one? Okay. But when you go there, it really is majestic. You've seen it, right? It's really majestic, you know? And this picture doesn't even do a due diligence, but it's a beautiful thing. And some people say it's the most recognized monument, the most recognized building in the country. And others have said it's the most recognized building in the world. But about 100 yards to the right and 100 yards to the left, there's people called press secretaries who do that. Now, we're going to talk about press secretaries in just a minute. But before I get into that, let me suggest this to you. The press secretary's work is something to which you have been exposed. Everyone in the room tonight has been influenced or been tried to be persuaded by work that the press secretaries did or do. You say, well, I don't really believe that. I would suggest to you that that's true, because anything that you've read about the United States Congress that wasn't spoken directly by a member of that Congress was probably influenced by a press secretary. Now, that certainly deals with domestic issues. such as Obamacare or the Affordable Health Care Act, but it also deals with international issues. So as we look up here, this was my trip to Saudi Arabia. I always like the picture on the right because I look so skinny, but that's where I'm But this was a brilliant situation, and so one of the things that the press secretaries are involved with up on Capitol Hill is certainly this process through which we change and influence laws. Do we go to war? Don't we go to war? Do we get foreign aid? Don't we get foreign aid? It's pretty significant, the work that they're doing. But on a lighter note, let me start my presentation right here. And the operative word is image. Image. And when we think about that, let me share this quote with you. The politician will be only too happy to advocate in favor of his image because the image is much more powerful than he could ever be. Now, it's a little bit sexist to quote, we should say he or she. But the reality here is that that image is powerful because what is the image that these press secretaries create? That image is our perception. And what is our perception? Our perception is our reality. So you could make a leap, it might be a leap and a strong leap, but you could suggest that if image is perception and perception is reality, then image is reality. If you can follow that logic, I could suggest to you that the reality that the press secretaries paint of these members of Congress becomes your reality and my reality. How do they look? What do they say? How do they say it? How do they use new media, social media, alternative media, digital media, traditional media? And so we're going to learn a little bit about who these people are. And I'll tell you more about them in just a minute. Let me suffice to say here what these folks do. And I'm going to look at a job description and share this with you, but let me share this first. In the United States House of Representatives, there are 435 representatives. In the United States Senate, there's 100 senators. Each of these legislators has at least one press secretary. So that would be 435 plus 100, 535. And then occasionally they have assistants. And some of those assistants would make up the roughly 550 press secretaries on Capitol Hill who send messages across the country, across the world. And those messages, of course, reach Saudi Arabia and other entities as well. Now, what's so interesting about these folks is that they're like satellites. So when you go to Capitol Hill and you begin to learn about the communication management there, what do you find? You find that each congressional office, each representative's office, each senator's office is a separate employer. And here's where it gets interesting. Each is a separate employer. Each works for a different legislator. Each has a different press secretary. And so what we're going to talk about tonight for the next 50 minutes or so are the commonalities among and between these people. Does that make sense to you guys? But here's what's so fascinating. If you're a press secretary for one member of Congress and you're a press secretary for another, your member may be from the ghettos of the United States, some of the roughest areas. Crime, rampant crime, drug problems, significant social problems. And your member of Congress may be from one of the wealthiest areas in the country, one of the most affluent. Yours may be a radical Democrat. Yours may be a radical liberal. Yours may think what we must do is give money to social programs, and what yours may say what we must do is teach people to lift them up by their bootstraps. Your messages may be based on compassion. Your messages may be based on something quite different. As we think about that, that's the mix. So when I talk about satellite, this is why I get kind of jazzed about this. Because all these people are buzzing around, each one working for an individual legislator, each legislator making a vote that influences my life and yours. So what do the press secretaries do? Well, let me share this brief description with you and see if we can't get started. They act as formal spokesperson and media liaison for members of Congress. They develop and implement media and communication strategies and public relations strategies. They must remain abreast of all the legislation that's before the Congress, from domestic to international. They provide ideas that affect the image of the member and his or her actions. Now, an interesting thing about them is that when they do these, when they practice these different skill sets, they must be good writers, they must be good editors, they must have strong communication skills, they must understand print, broadcast, and online media, and increasingly they must understand new social, alternative, and emerging media. They must be up to date on current events. And how do they work? They work in little cubicles. They work in little cubicles, scattered among the staff. Their average age for the House of Representatives is about 32 years old, so they're relatively young. And what they say they must be able to do is to work with significant stress, because in fact, there's no question that the press secretaries have significant stress in their work. So where does all this go? Let me offer you a summary comment. The press secretaries, remember, work for individual members of Congress. Those individual members may be one of the 435 members in the House of Representatives or one of the 100 senators. As their job is to handle external communication. And what do I mean by external communication? That's communication largely that emanates from the office that meets you, either through traditional media channels via a reporter or through new media channels. Am I on track? Is this okay with you guys? Am I pretty clear with what I'm getting at? So that's the folks who we're looking at. And it really becomes so interesting when we begin to think about these guys. Because here's what's so fascinating. There's only 50 pages, fewer than 50 pages, in the academic literature where people have studied these people. Here's a quote from a press secretary. It's interesting that you mentioned that you found only 50 pages or so that discuss the press secretaries. That is because we are really doing our jobs. The better job I do, the less you'll see my name or face. Now here's what's so interesting. We've got folks from all over the world. We've got scholars. We've got some tremendous grad students. And I'll bet you, with the possible exception of the two professors here from Lasell, that no one in the room, save myself, can name one press secretary. You see, that's the goal. The goal is for the press secretary never to be noticed. It's not about the press secretary. Who do you think it's about? It's only about the legislator. And the interesting thing about what these folks do, they say, well, Eddie, do they have big egos? And I say, they don't have big egos. And they say, why? I know they think they're self-important. And I say, no, they don't have big egos. They're not self-important. Why? Because the only one who gives them credit is the member of Congress, if he or she wants to, and their colleagues in the office. Other than that, they're quiet. So what I like about this picture that Lou did, Lou did a great job on this, but one thing she did, Lou, I don't know if I mentioned this to you, I like how you've got this under the dome. Under the dome. Because the press secretaries certainly work under the dome. They're not on top, they're not raising the flag, they're under the dome. But their work influences you and me. As we move forward, this is an interesting thing. Let's begin to get into this. I'll read this to you out loud. I think the hardest thing, especially when I've encountered new press secretaries, was that they couldn't divorce their own personal feelings from what they had to do for their boss. They had to forget that they didn't exist, that they were actually their bosses. And they were also their boss's spouses. I don't want to get into that. And play both roles constantly, all the time. My job isn't to promote myself and write things with my name on them. My job is to promote my boss and get his name in the paper, get his picture in it. This is interesting. Have you ever picked up the newspaper and there's something called a pull quote? You know how there's like the regular print in the newspaper, right? And then there's like a quote that's, maybe it's a different font and it's larger. That's called a pull quote. This is what one said. I once had a big pull quote in a large newspaper, the kind they usually use for members. And I was really uncomfortable with it. I'm a little mortified when I see stuff like that. So this is who these people are. But the theme that I want to continue to reinforce with you is that their work is significant. And it's that same logical pattern that I suggested. They shape images, images shape perception, perceptions become realities, hence public relations practitioners shape our realities, at least to some extent. Now, I'm going to read this one. God, I can't find it. Let me just see if I can get it up here. According to a new study, if you work for the House, for example, you are more than likely to, from the public, this is about press secretaries, to suffer from stomach disorders several times daily. The study shows that women are more likely to suffer heartburn as press secretaries than men, and many say the problem is the stressful lives and poor eating habits. So, another theme that emerges is that the work these folks do is not recognized, it's not known, but it's stressful as all get out. Somebody said, why are they so young? And I think one reason they're so young, I said 32. I was off on that data. I think it's 32 on the Senate side and about 28 on the House side. Roughly 30 years old. When we think about that, think about the stress that they're under. It's every bit as stressful working for a political celebrity, at least celebrity in terms of his or her congressional district, as Angelina Jolie's press secretary, or Kevin Costner's press secretary, or God forbid, Miley Cyrus's press secretary, or God forbid even more, Lady Gaga's press secretary. The point is that all those people I just mentioned have press secretaries, but none of them know who we are. But what do they share in common? Lady Gaga has an image that she's trying to portray that becomes our reality about Lady Gaga. Miley Cyrus's press secretary has been working overtime. Publicist has been working overtime to give us a certain perception. So Dr. Vera was shaking her head. I'm always glad when she shakes her head affirmatively because it means I'm right. She mentioned that, and in fact, that is a very stressful job. Now, here's what's interesting. I'd ask you just for fun to think about the United States. Think about the United States. From coast to coast. So from the tip of Maine down to southern Florida, across New Mexico to southern California, up to Washington, and into the Alaska tundra. And think of all the cultures, subcultures, co-cultures across the country. Each of those co-cultures is represented by a member of Congress. And each of those members of Congress has a press secretary. But here's what's so interesting. There's been a paradigm shift, and I'm so glad I can use the word paradigm. I've been waiting to do that because I'm supposed to use words like paradigm. I also want to use the term socioeconomic variables, but I haven't figured out how to do that yet. But I'm working on it. When we think about this, think about, a large soccer field that you might see or a large football field? Think about all the grass on that field. And if you look at that large field, think about it this way. That field represents the history of human communication. Back to the caveman days, and our friend Mel DeFleur would, this is a mentor for both of us, a leading scholar in our field. He actually shared this analogy, and that's why I'm sharing it with you. On that field are thousands and thousands of blades of grass. And what I'd ask you to do is to reach down and pick up one blade of grass and hold it. Take the tip of that blade of grass, tear it off, and hold what's remaining in your hand. That portion of the soccer field, that portion of the football field, that portion of human history represents human history through which we've been using new social alternative media. So there's been this big paradigm shift where all of a sudden these press secretaries are no longer working solely with traditional reporters, but words like tweeting, Facebook, etc. have come into the vernacular. So this is the challenge that they face, and I'll tell you that they're not quite sure what to do with that. And I'll take in just a little while, just a little bit more, about where I think they're going with that. Now, here's what's interesting. And I think Lou is a great person, a great assistant, but she also gives great slide. Can we just give Lou a hand for the slide? So what you do is, these were the words when I asked someone to describe press secretaries. I would ask them, what word would describe your life here on Capitol Hill? What word? And these were among the main words. They say, I pitch, I update, I advise, i.e. I advise the member of Congress. I monitor, i.e. I monitor what we call in public relations boundary spanning, the social, political, cultural, economic variables revolving around. I write, I think, I do, and I hope. Now, hope is really the operative word here, because what you're doing is you're working for a member of Congress hoping that his or her message will permeate and be reinforced. You're hoping. And when you're working with traditional reporters, to some degree, you're losing control of that message. I give it to the reporter must in turn send it out, and I hope it's attended to. And then the big question that they started asking more and more and more and more is, what do I do with new media? Now, the thing to keep in mind here when we think about press secretaries is this interesting quote. Press secretaries are not, and this is it's attributed to me. That's why I said it's interesting. You might find it really boring. Press secretaries are not robots, and communicating with their audience remains at its core as much an art as a science practiced differently by different press secretaries, each with unique strengths and weaknesses, with varying degrees of success, each for a different member. Now, Lou, this is a great picture. Do you want to can I just bother you for a minute? Just share why you've actually put these. Do you know the person on the right? His name was Congressman Anthony Weiner. He was involved in some online activity that was objectionable, and he got caught, and he left Congress, and he ran for mayor of New York, and he lost. So he's a guy who was really in the news recently. But I'm going to let you get rid of my voice for a minute. Just turn to Lou and ask you, Lou, why did you choose this slide?
The reason why I choose this slide is I want to give an impression to the audience. It's the press secretary is not only taking care of the communication stuff, but they manage prizes. Your boss may be, the one who appears in the center of the stage, and all your work is behind the scene, but you have to manage prizes. When prizes happen, scandal happen, and when protests are there, and all those constituents fight against your bosses, you have to help your boss, and then peace the anger and solve the crisis. So I say you have to have a stronger heart than your bosses, and to be a president.
Lou should do a doctorate. It's much smarter than I am. But when you think about this is what these guys are doing. So when the crisis strikes, and it will, the press secretary is on the front line. What do crises do? Crises make news. Press secretaries try to control news. As a matter of fact, every member of Congress has political enemies. And I don't think this is too strong. Maybe Dr. Barrett can qualify it a little bit. There's a number of those enemies who want to destroy this person, who are his or her worst nightmare. And we're finding that increasingly in the American political system, that we are becoming more and more dichotomized. We're becoming more and more mutually exclusive. We're not getting along. And something that they call gridlock has resulted. And that's something that press secretaries in recent years have begun to mention to me more and more. And some of them are leaving their job because they just throw up their hands and say, I can't deal with the gridlock. Now, this is a good slide. I hate my boss or I like my boss. So the question here is, what do these press secretaries think of their bosses? What do they think of their bosses? In other words, what is their relationship like with the member of Congress for whom they work? So Lou, I'm turning to you again. Here's the big question. Do they hate their boss or do they love their boss? They love the boss. They love this boss so much, in fact, that they will put their own ethical stances, their own values on second place to promote those of their boss. If they don't agree with their boss, they promote it anyway. Isn't that a funny thing? You may be vehemently opposed to food stamps, but if you're a press secretary and the member of Congress for whom he works believes in food stamps, you know what you believe in? Food stamps! So as we think about this is what they're doing. And these relationships, it got so interesting to study because it got to the point where I just said, oh my gosh, you call this person your boss. Your worth is tied up in his or her existence. Whatever he or she wants, you do. And you get to know these people, and you know the members of Congress, not the way that we see them on C-SPAN, with nice hair and nice suits and starched white shirts, but you see them in all sorts of venues. One press secretary told me the story of a member of Congress. He was just overwhelmed and he's sobbing in his office. We never see that. But let me share this kind of interesting story with you. This is kind of an interesting quotation At least I think it's kind of interesting. It's called the babysitter. So let me read this to you. And I know sometimes when you're working with an audience, when you read, you can lose their attention, so please try to stay with me. And I'll try to read it somewhat dramatically. Maybe I can read it in a radio announcer's voice. Well, the press secretary, we can do that if you want to. All right. Here's the quote. The babysitter. I think that this quote, as a social scientist, as a researcher, as we talk to people, we say, what themes emerge? What are commonalities? Does that make sense to you? And eventually we read something called saturation, where you ask the question, tell me about your relationship with a member, and you can predict that it's going to be just like a babysitter. So in my recent trip to Capitol Hill, about 80% of the time, when I would ask a press secretary a question, what I would get was something that I knew, that I suspected. And that was a good sign for me. It was a big relief, because it showed to some degree I had reached saturation. And babysitter certainly has. Here's the quote. Press secretaries take excessively good care of the members, and I'm using the term members, which is short for members of Congress. Press secretaries take excessively good care of the members they serve. One during a focus group described her job as that of a, quote, babysitter sometimes, end quote. Another as a, quote, babysitter all the time. The group talked about receiving and responding to calls, quote, at 4 in the damn morning from the members about delivering bad news to the media, quote, so the member wouldn't have to, end quote. This babysitter theme was reinforced consistently over the years between 1993 and 2014. Press secretaries told me they run personal errands for the member, know the details of their boss's family and personal life, can gauge the member's moods, are ever aware of the member's quirks, fears, and habits. One, for example, described how the congressman for whom she worked called his wife Mommy. Another told the story of how the member had served faithfully for years, closed his eyes and cried when the pressure of his job overwhelmed him. How do the press secretaries feel about this babysitter role? Well, they are resigned to, not resentful toward it. It's a fascinating thing that happens. They are subservient babysitters who willingly manage members of Congress. Keep going. The following excerpt from one of the first focus groups I did in 1993 with a press secretary was shared by a former press secretary who worked for one of the nation's most prominent members of Congress. Its brief tale illustrates the good care the press secretary took of her boss. Here's the story. The senator, she said, would wear a white shirt, and when he was going to be interviewed on camera, his wife thought that color looked best on him. She continued. Now, before I get to the quote, but when we look back to 93, the way that the television cameras work, if you wore a white shirt and you were pale, it would wash out your face. Does that make sense to you? There was no high definition, etc. Does that make sense to you? So that was what she was concerned about. And here's what she said. He'd go on TV and you basically couldn't see him. It was like nothing from the neck up. And I told him one day, look it, I do TV for you, Senator, and you've got to wear a blue shirt. Otherwise, I'm not letting you on camera anymore. He believed me, and he smuggled the blue shirt out of the house and into the car while I was visiting his house so I could take it to the office. It hung in the office for 3 years, and I made a change every time he went on television. You see, this babysitter theme has always been there, overtly or in the background, in tales such as the one just described. One long-term press secretary told me something that led to the book's title, and it's this. Press secretaries have to work on the image of the member. She continued telling me they must take care of it. So the question then comes up, how do they work with traditional reporters? Well, press secretaries use many of the same tools that most public relations practitioners use. News releases, media alerts, media advisories, bios, Q's and A's, etc. But when I tried to understand a term, I said, tell me about working with reporters. And they told me 3 things that were very, very interesting. Number one, they said unequivocally, remember, and this is a direct quote, the reporters are not our friends. They said you can have a cordial relationship, but they're not your buddies. Number 2, the reporters with whom we work share a symbiotic relationship with us. Has anyone been up to Gloucester, Massachusetts, where you watch the whales? If you watch whales, you'll notice they have barnacles on them. The barnacle needs the whale needs the barnacle, it's symbiotic. It's not a relationship that they would choose, but they must have it. And the third most interesting, among the most interesting things they said was this. I would ask them, I said, if I'm teaching an introductory public relations class, what should I make sure my students know about working with the media? And what the press secretary said over and over and over again was this: don't lie. If you lie and you're caught, you can't be a source. And again, this is a fairly logical progression. Think about it with me. If you lie, you can't be a source of information. If you can't be a source of information, you can't be a press secretary. Therefore, if you lie, you can't be a press secretary. Does that make sense to you? Now, there's a larger discussion that Dr. Jabeck can have with you about what we mean by lying and what we mean by truth. So the word, the phrase, the concept that described their relationship with the traditional media was guarded honesty. I work out of guarded honesty. It's kind of an oxymoron, just like thunderous silence or jumbo shrimp. You know what I mean? Guarded honesty? But that's the best that I could do, trying to extract from them, what is this like? How do you work with these media? It wasn't guarded, and it wasn't honest. It was some weird kind of nebulous description without shape or without form that describes how they do this. And one was actually quite vehement with me, and he said, and I can give you a direct quote on this. Remember, damn it, they need us. No, remember, damn it, I need them, but damn it, they need me too. As we push on and go a little bit forward with this, I want to share with you, because we're approaching the halfway point of my comments. You can see what I'm trying to share with you is not the job description of the press secretary. I read you that, you have a sense of that. You can Google a job description. What I'm trying to do is to get to the next level. As our mentor, Mel, used to say, you're trying to understand the theories in their heads. You're trying to understand, right? You're trying to understand, who are these people? Does that make sense to you? You see, because we could bring a press secretary in here who would tell you much more about his or her job than I could. Does that make sense to you? But what a privilege to be able to step back and look inward and say, okay, collectively, what's going on here? And you're trying to be, as you do this research, you're trying to be controlled, you're trying to be subjective, and you're trying to gather, to the degree that you can, data which are reliable, which are both valid and reliable. But that's the term that came up when I said, how do they work with the media? It deals largely with this notion of guarded honesty. In answer to the open-ended question, what words would a typical, Lou, I love these slides. Thank you. In answer to the open-ended question, what words would a typical journalist use to describe the press secretary? 1/3 of respondents, that is 1/3 of the press secretaries, or 33%, use the word hack or flack. And only 21% use the word helpful. Negative comments outweigh positive by a factor of 2 to 1. In later questioning, 44% of press secretaries agreed with this statement. Quote, journalists believe that press secretaries are self-serving hacks. Now, I've already brought up this idea, but I want to move a little bit into the notion of new media, social media, alternative media, digital media, online media, alternative media. I'll just call it new media for now, but think about this. I've already given you the football, at least what I hope, and Mel gave me this, Mel DeFleur gave me this. But what I like about this, Lou, if you're good with this, I love this depiction that you've chosen on the far right. Would you share with our audience, with our friends, why you've chosen that depiction? Can you see it okay?
Yeah, I can. As you see that that figure standing in the center is social media, and the basic meaning of this is like, with the fast development of social media today, and the traditional media, including like television, newspapers, and radios, that more and more people choose to use social media instead of the traditional media. And for the statutory things, like you need to catch up the fastest pace of the social media. You need to one step forward to the the traditional reporters and editors. You gotta know how to use and control the social media better than anyone else, and you know how to utilize them. Otherwise, you can't help your boss. You can't help your boss to use that stuff.
Perfect. Thanks, Lou. It's so interesting, and I tell you, man, this has been kind of fun to watch because you would think, some people think, well, members of Congress, of course, are on the cutting edge with social media. And let me tell you that some are and some aren't. Remember that they're independent employers. But one of the fun things about doing this work, and I'm just going to take a little breather here for a minute and share this with you. One of the fun things is falling off the table. One of the fun things about this work is this. You get to follow the evolution of the research. Does that make sense to you? As social scientists, we work in fields like anthropology, sociology, psychology, political science, economics, psychology to a large degree. We're dealing with sciences that deal with people. Does that make sense? Contrast that with sciences of the natural science, which deal like chemistry or biology or physics, which are fairly standard and predictable. You see, as a social scientist, Dr. Jabek, Dr. Barrett, what we're after is the notion of people. Social sciences involve people, and people are malleable. Now, because so few people have written about the press secretaries, I don't know of any articles specifically talking about press secretaries as a unit of analysis in Congress using new media. But I had an interesting conversation. This is where I think this is a really interesting conversation. I don't want to build it up too much, but it was, what's today? Is today Wednesday? Today, Wednesday, right? Okay. I think it was last Thursday. I was sitting in the press secretary's office, and you can never tell who you were talking to. You have to be confidential. But I was asking him about new media, and he said to me, in essence, everybody's doing it wrong. Well, as an interviewer, I was particularly interested when somebody says everybody's doing it wrong because you want to know what's going to come up next. He said they continue to not realize the value of social media and the analytical tools contained within. What he was suggesting to me was, in fact, that there's a constant monitor through social media of who's receiving what message at what point, who's responding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they follow closely tweets, they follow closely Facebook, and they follow very, very closely this. And what they're finding here, what he's finding, is he said the role of a press secretary is changing significantly. It's no longer get a message and try to shape an image, but rather it's a continuous two-way symmetrical model where the messages are coming in and you're constantly revising and shaping them, So the messages sent are absolutely as important as the messages coming in. Does that make sense to you? And this is fully affinitive with the leading scholars in the public relations field, the Grunigs, who talk about the two-way symmetrical model, which you may or may not have come across. But the notion is that what makes for an effective relationship with the media is a conversation with the media, not a one-way exchange. And through these new media, what some of the more advanced press secretaries are doing is using them constantly. Does that make sense to you? The way I would describe it, it's almost as if they were holding hands, and they were boundary spanning, and they're spinning around. Social, political, cultural, economic, and they're constantly in this exchange. You might think of it as a boxer. If you're boxing and you're throwing these punches and stuff, at the same time you're throwing, you're trying to block punches. Or you might think of it as a dance, where one person is moving with the other. But that's a shift, I think, that we're going to talk about. I'll be glad to talk more about that, if you'd like me to. So the question then comes up, how do they decide the issues on which they're focused? Stem cell research, gun control, gay rights, abortion, immigration. How do they know which issue they should focus on? Now that's a logical question, isn't it? Because if you think about it, cognitively, it's hard for me to think of gun control, abortion, agriculture simultaneously. And it's even more difficult to determine into what am I going to put my time today. So it was interesting, and again, there's a mentor who both Dr. Barrett was my mentor, This guy was Dr. Barrett's mentor and mine. And his name was Melvin DeFleur, as I mentioned before, and I was talking to him, and he said, I'm really glad you're studying press secretaries, because no one's studying them. But see if you can find out a theoretical notion related to how they send messages. Now, at the risk of oversimplification, I think what we're getting to when we use the term theoretical, to some degree, and there's different types of theories, etc. We can get into that if you want. But the main thing is we're trying to figure out, what is it that we do? So when we think about the notion of agenda setting, McCombs and Shaw in 1972, the media don't tell us what to think, but tell us what to think about. So what do? They tell us what to think about. So this wave notion really has been an intriguing one. Let me share with you where it came from. When we think about this, don't read the bottom quote. Pay attention. Don't read the bottom quote. I was talking to a press secretary from Southern California who lived on the coast. And he was a very cool, laid-back guy, and I said, how do you decide the issues on which you want to focus? And he said, this is a direct quote, it's like a wave, man. This is what I don't, and to be frank with you, I don't have a citation here because I forgot exactly who said it. And in the transcript of the focus group, I didn't make a notation. But it was one press secretary during a focus group who said this. I find stuff, or issues, right? Abortion, agriculture, social issues, etc. I find stuff, issues goes in waves, the way stories ebbs and flow. You get a little wave of a particular story, and if your boss has an appropriate committee assignment, or appropriate area of expertise, or appropriate geographical location, you try to catch it. Sometimes you'll ride off the back of the wave, and nothing will happen. Other times you'll catch it and ride it for your boss. I think we've got the foundation to develop some theoretical understanding when it comes time to the notion of what we call agenda subsidies, Turk and Gandhi. Sorry, those two people who wrote about this. But the people who subsidize the media, the people who subsidize it, how and under what circumstances. And this wave notion, at least in my opinion, seems to address the larger question of subsidization, of agenda subsidies. How do we determine who's going to get what? This is kind of a hard one to explain, and I can do it, I think. It's going to take me just a minute, because there's some incongruity in what I'm going to say next. The large question is this: what power do the press secretaries have? Now, I've tried to build a case that they're powerful. And I return to the analogy, to the syllogism that I used initially. They shape images, images shape perceptions, perceptions shape realities, hence press secretaries shape realities, right? Okay, you've heard that. That's like the third or fourth time I said. But there's a dirty little secret in Washington. And that is there's a dirty little secret in Washington, D.C. that everybody knows but few dare acknowledge. Congressional staff, as an unelected continuum, congressional staff serves as an unelected continuum from which there is no escape. Or maybe the bottom quote summarizes it well. The member of Congress has power, and the press secretary is the member of Congress. So this is where it becomes kind of a funny relationship when you think about it, because you think, you know, they must have some power. They have control over the message. To some degree, they determine, as a gatekeeper, who's going to have access to the member of Congress, who isn't. There's some question about that. There's some power. But as you think about it a little bit further, that power is fully vested because they work for someone powerful. And an analogy that I can use is Angelina Jolie's publicist powerful? Not without Angelina Jolie, but with Angelina Jolie. Depending on Angelina's personality and preferences, he or she may be more powerful. So as we think about this notion of power, just think about that a little bit. And it is a dirty little secret. This is what I saw when I was just up on Capitol Hill. It was so interesting because so little had changed. And again, I think Dr. Barrett can appreciate this one, and maybe Dr. Jenner as well. As we think about this, what does it look like? I noticed what I did was I took a lunch break, and I went down to the restaurant, the main restaurants, probably Bull Feathers was one of them, probably Yeah, all the members of Congress
All
eat
the
down there,
staff,
all the
yeah.
staff. And so I went down there, and I just immersed myself, a little bit like an ethnographer. And I just said, what are the rhythms? What's going on here? And I'll be frank with you, very little had changed in terms of rhythms from when I had been on Capitol Hill some 25 years ago, 30 years ago. What were they wearing? I took a little informal survey. 90% men, white starched shirts. 90% men, matching suits. Women were dressed equally conservatively, professionally, albeit it's more difficult to describe what women were wearing. But I think you know what I mean. So I had to decide today when I came out here, I said, how should I dress? Should I dress as if I'm in Washington, D.C.? And this is a true story. I don't want to get into it too much. But I have a nice suit that I was going to wear, and I put it on, and it was a little bit tight. I don't want to get into it. So I said, I can't dress like a press secretary today, but I'll dress like a press secretary when Congress is not in session, when they're not voting, when they're not in town. You see, Congress votes usually only Tuesday through Thursday, and they're gone elsewhere. Does that make sense to you? And so as I think about these folks just a little bit, I said, what do you wear in this? Oh, we're casual when they're not in session. And you can watch this. If you watch C-SPAN, you'll see in back of the member of Congress, you may be press secretary. It's a quick story. There was a friend of mine who was a press secretary for a fairly well-known member of Congress. In the U.S., we have things called bachelor parties, and those are the parties that you have before you go out and get married, and they're somewhat raucous. What I can share with you is that I saw my old friend sitting right about, Dr. Barrett's here, and he was about a foot in back of her. And his face looked a little heavier, he had some wrinkles, he had some gray hair, but I knew this was my buddy. I hadn't seen him for many years. And there he is whispering into the member of Congress's ear, and I don't know what he was saying, I don't know what he was saying, but something, with the hope that he would say something to that member of Congress, so when that member of Congress communicates, it's favorable to him. And all I was thinking was, wait a minute, I know this guy. I'll call him Dan. I know this guy, Dan. Last time I saw him, we were in a limousine. We'd rented a limousine. We're driving by the White House. It's his bachelor party. There was lots of beer, and that's as much as I can tell you about that. But as we think about that, that's an interesting thing. You see, this person, what do I call him, Dan? Is that what I call him? Dan. This person, Dan, you'll never hear of him. You don't know who he is. He's been doing this for 30 years. But the member of Congress for whom he works had a significant leadership for which Dan, at least, was in part responsible. I went to Dan's office, and again, I'm changing the name, and I was about as close as you and I are here. There's a wall between us. And Dan looked, and he was quite proud. He said, my boss, and he named the congressman by the first name, called him John. My boss, John, is here. I'm here, and we take care of each other. Now, the large question, and this is kind of an academic question, and this was, when I was doing the early research, this was one that, my dissertation committee wanted me to make sure I answered. And this was before I met the great Dr. Barrett, who frankly, to be frank with you, knows more about politics than I. She really does. So, as we think about this, the question is their work good for democracy? I mean, there's a subtitle to the book that I want to include, but I don't know what to do. Somebody said use the subtitle because it's going to sell the book, but I'm not mean. I don't want to be mean, but here's the subtitle. The title, Press Secretary. Underneath that, the story of Capitol Hill's image makers. The subtitle, where hacks, flacks, and spin doctors meet the good citizens of the United States. So are these hacks, these flacks, these spin doctors, speaking for Georgia, are these folks good for our democracy? Or if you're studying public relations, is public relations good for democracy? I was in Miami a month ago with a bunch of academics. And you always got to be a little bit on guard when you're with academics. But I was with them, and somebody said, he had a great beard. Interesting question. Are they good for democracy? I'm thinking to myself, I just asked the question. All you're doing is repeating it and making it sound more intelligent. Are they good for democracy? I just asked that question. I just asked that. And I said, I was talking about the press secretaries, and I said to someone, the press secretaries are like many other PR professionals. And somebody in the back said, do you think they are like PR professionals? I just said they're like academics. Anyway. The academics really did a good job. They said, are they good for democracy? So this is a question that I pondered over the time. It's a tough question, but there seem to be three things, at least maybe, that we can think about, and this isn't the answer because I don't have a good answer for you. But number one is this. A healthy democracy is an informed democracy. So to the degree that we are more informed, they are good for democracy. Number two, just something to think about. Number two, press secretaries are essential to sharing messages into democracy because logically, every member of Congress can't be available 24/7 to people who want to communicate. Now, I had an interesting conversation, and point number three, and this is one like, I got to explore it, I got to look at it, I got to think about it, I got to interview people, I got to talk to Janice, Dr. Jan Beck, I got to talk to you guys and figure out what to do with this question. But the third they said was, I was talking to a student, Ellie, and she was saying, she just read the book, and she said, it's interesting when I think about these folks because we want our leaders to appear a certain way. Now, you can despise Bill Clinton, or you can despise Barack Obama, or you can despise Ronald Reagan, or you can despise George Bush. But she said, even when I despise so-and-so, it still upsets me when he's dressed like a cowboy chopping wood, or when he's dressed like a basketball player, or when he's stuffing a burger into his mouth. Does that make sense to you? So maybe we do need the press secretaries to enhance the image. So this is an area that I'm going to explore further, and hopefully if I have the privilege of coming out and talking to you again, I can find out what I learned. But that's the kind of questions that come up that you begin to learn the answers to. In conclusion, this is what one said, I wish I could step back far enough to really see my job and the jobs of my colleagues like you are. Because I feel like I'm so close to it that I can't see clearly. And I probably tend to be more cynical. I probably take things for granted. And the only time I can really appreciate what we do is when I step away from it. That's what I did. I think, Janice, I'm sorry. I think these are all Democrats, yes. And I think the next slide is all Republicans. So I want to stay bipartisan, nonpartisan. I don't want to piss anybody off. Right? So I have to consider about every other day on my job that I work for someone who's been elected to office, with the people that put a trust in. Moreover, that someone is working for a federal government that, for better or worse, is the government that has been established by the people and our Constitution. And it's a weighty responsibility. I don't care if you look at this, but this is just, because I figure because we're in an academic environment, I'll show you, this is some of the research that's going on. But you can see the first one, what was interesting was this guy, Mel Lafleur, who we talked about. And I'll finish up in just about 3 minutes, if that's okay. Okay. This guy I've spoken about, Mel Lafleur, Dr. Barrett's mentor, my mentor. He's kind of like a BS sitter in the field of mass communication. And I went into him, very naive, and I said, I think I'm going to study press secretaries on Capitol Hill. And within about 3 minutes, he said to me, that's a good idea, go do it. And that was the foundation. And so you'll see the first thing we did, he said, get on the phone. No, what he said actually, look at the literature. So we looked at the literature and we found at that point, remember I said there's about 50 pages? I'd written about 25 of them. So at that time, there was about 25 pages. One study from 1989, one study from 1991. And he said, just get on the phone. Don't have a structure. Don't put a frame around it. Don't have specific questions, because then you're going to limit your inquiry. He said, just get on the phone and talk to them about their lives. And that was the earliest incantation of this. When we got on this, we just called, tell me about your life. What do you accept or make sense to you? Through the years, we did some qualitative work, some quantitative work. We did survey work. We did content analyses. We did in-depth interviews. We did semi-structured, unstructured interviews. We did focus group, etc. But you'll notice the last thing I did was in-person interviews with current press secretaries. So kind of what had happened in this process was we started very broad up here, and we narrowed here. And so my most recent conversations with these folks dealt with the idea where I talked about where we'd reach saturation. Does that make sense to you? Where we could kind of predict. So the questions become more and more and more narrow. But all social inquiry is limited by time and money. And I'm very curious about a few things. One thing I'm curious about that I'd like to learn more about is what my student was saying. We're interested in these members of Congress and we want them to have a certain image, even if we despise them. Something to think about. And another interesting conversation, gave a talk similar to this in Washington, as I mentioned last week. And in the audience was a reporter who'd been on Capitol Hill for 30 years. I'm nervous about it. I'm like, geez, she really knows the Hill. She said, you're on track. She said, you should speak to the members of Congress themselves. It's a great suggestion. So I'm like thinking, what do I do with this? And I said, well, as researchers, we have to get access to information. We have to be able to gather the data. Does that make sense? We have to either get the people or the data to gather it so we can analyze it. I said, I was concerned because when I went to the press secretaries, when I went door to door, I passed out a questionnaire to all 535 of them. And I got 435. I got a 48% response rate, which is pretty good. Almost 1 in 2 into this we filled out the survey question, the survey instrument. And it was really interesting. And I said, I think if I had gone to members of Congress, I'm not going to have that kind of response rate. And to be frank with you, I had thought about that, but I was worried if I do a dissertation on this and nobody answers, I'm not going to get done. So that's essentially what happened. But you know what she said? She said, you know who you should talk to? She said, you know who you should talk to? Former members of Congress. They'll talk to you. They're spread out all over Washington. They're lobbying. They're all over. They'd love to talk to you. So that's where I think some of the research may be going. People ask me what the press secretaries are like. A lot of them think they're familiar with the presidential press secretary, so they think that they stand before cameras and have news conferences. Anybody ever seen that? I never have seen a congressional press secretary have a news conference. I've seen the members for whom they work have news conferences. I know that they might prepare the member even with a briefing before that news conference, but they're not doing it. So people ask me, what are the press secretaries like? My response today has been the same as it was when I first started talking to and studying them back in 1993. They are good people. While I disagree with the political positions of some, there are a few I would not welcome as a friend or colleague. Truth be told, a handful of former congressional press secretaries from both parties are relatively close friends of mine and are among the most ethical public relations communication managers I know. No kidding. And while it might surprise some, and while a few press secretaries are full of themselves and chock full of ego, as a group they are not. In my opinion, anyway, they don't come across that way. While most are confident, most also have their egos in check. I suspect this is because so much of what they do is done behind the scenes and thus remains unrecognized. After all, when they do a good job, the credit inevitably goes to their boss, not to them. In fact, many have told me in one way or another that no one outside of their offices cared about their accomplishments. I'm not just making it up. As long as their boss was well respected, they were happy. They did not expect and seldom got kudos. Further, most were amazingly straight shooters. Few, in my opinion, tried to spin me. Now, you say, how do you know that they didn't spin you? Because you would ask this different people over the years the same question. Does this make sense to you, the same question? And unless every single one of them was spinning me the same way, they probably weren't. My sense was never that they were lying to me. I really believed that. And thankfully, dozens were willing to take time with me, offering me facts, rich stories, anecdotes that illustrated what they do, many of which I share in this book. The vast majority were forthcoming. If I called them lazy or crooked or shady or corrupt, then what I have shared in this book and what I have shared with you tonight might be more sensational or lurid, and in turn might sell more copies. Remember, conflict sells. But that would be a lie. Contrary to some people's popular beliefs, they are, as I mentioned, good folks. I am forever grateful to each member of this special group of communication managers who participated in my research, thus giving a part of himself or herself to me. And now that you've finished the book, or now that you've heard my lecture, the press secretaries have given a part of themselves to you as well. Thanks.
In one of the slides, you made the comment here, 44% of press secretaries agreed with the statement that, quote, journalists believe press secretaries are self-serving hacks. Now that's their perception of what the journalists think of them. But if you were going to do some triangulation in your research, then yes, it might be a really good idea to interview either current or former members of Congress who might have a different perception. But I would be curious to know whether or not the journalists and the editors that they interact with on a daily basis really do have that opinion. Maybe they don't. Because also one of the press secretaries said, they need me as much as I need them. So the journalists do have to have a good relationship with the press secretaries to get the information for the member, you know, from the member coming through the press secretary. So that might be one other piece that might be interesting to look at. I don't know, what do you think?
I thank you so much for the comment. You're always trying to say, what do we do next? Where does the research go next, right? And that's a great vehicle. I think that'd be a great thing. I thank you for the suggestion. It's a great, I thought a little bit about that, but coming from you, I got to think about it more carefully. I think that'd be a great way to do it because we've only looked at half. In terms of working, when it comes to new media, we're looking at a different venue.
Right.
But when we're with traditional media, we're looking at building relationships with traditional journalists, broadcast, print, etc. And I've only looked at the press secretary's perception of the journalist, and your thing is go talk to some journalists and see how they perceive the press secretaries. Right. And it may not be as negative. They may actually feel it's a great.
It goes back to Gruning's theory on the two-way symmetrical relationship.
Right.
And you mentioned the symmetrical relationship several times.
Right.
So it would be good to see whether or not this self-perception is in fact either confirmed or not confirmed.
Great. I got to do it. I mean, there's, you know, it's kind of fun to do this because you're kind of.
You'll never get the book.
No, I told Janice, I said, I got an idea for a second book. And she said, she and my other mentor, Otto Lerbinger, who spoke to you guys. Yeah. Isn't he great? Mm-hmm. You get better than Otto Lerbinger. I mean, he remember when I came back from dinner and I went to Matt and said, like, I don't know what you said, but like, write your book. Don't think about the second book. Get the book done.
When you went on sabbatical, I gave you a pen. Write the book.
Write the book.
Even if you have to use a pen.
It's true. You're not going to do a pen. So the book's done. I'm just sending it out to publishers now. So what else can I help you with? I'm curious if you all, because you all have read, Cecilia, you haven't, but Molly, you've read the book, and so has Lou. But I want to know if there's anything I can be of assistance to you, or if
Well, we do have one student in the class, Aziz, who I hope was going to be here before class, so you could meet him. But he is here now. And Aziz, do you want to tell Dr. Downs what your job is in Saudi Arabia and want to comment on whether or not it's similar to how the press secretaries are in America, or are there differences?
It's different. I work for the Parliament of Saudi Arabia. I used to work as journalist in the Shura Council, the Parliament of Saudi Arabia. Now I work as diplomat in the Shura Council. It's so different with the Congress. I know because we have every year we have like 4 delegations come from the Congress of the United States, just the staff of the Congress. So just the staff, they come to Saudi Arabia to visit the Parliament of Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
Just the staff. Some of them they work for the press secretary, but I didn't have the chance to talk with them about how they work. But I know the big difference between us and, let's say, we have just department for the press or the public relations department. Part of the public relations department is about journalists, how we can deal with the newspapers, with the traditional newspapers, with the journalists, reporters. The most important thing, how we control the interview, the member of the Shura Council with about the issue about the parliament, because they have their own life. We don't care if they just talk with the newspaper or with the TV about their own life or their experience before they come to the parliament. But if any issue about the parliament, they have to ask us. We have to deal with these journalists or reporters, what the questions, what they will ask them. If they don't want to tell us the exactly questions they want to ask, we ask them about what the issue they want to talk. Each delegation from the Parliament of Saudi Arabia, if you visit any parliament or conference, we send one of these journalists that work in the parliament. If this member of the Shura Council will do interview, or they write press release about the events or about the visitors. I mean, that's what we do.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think, we think about what to do next. I mentioned talking to former members of Congress. Dr. Barrett mentioned talking to journalists. And I'll tell you, we've just scratched the surface. Lou has been doing a little bit of work, and I said, look at the Chinese system. Look at Canada. And maybe next we could interview you and look at Saudi Arabia. Because I think that the differences are so extreme that we could learn a lot by virtue of the differences, depending on the political system. That would be my sense, where we find much more congruity in Canada or in Britain, and much less in Saudi Arabia, etc. So thank you for the comment. Thank you so much. Anything else, please?
Right now, this is what I remember. Because we talk when we attend any conference or we visit another parliament, as a journalist or work for the public relation, I wanna know what their system like, or how they work in the parliament, how their relations with the members of the parliament, how their relations with the newspapers or the media relations. Yes. Or as media relations with the media, with the traditional media, or with the new media right now.
Yes.
Always we have different perspective. I would say how they work, how their system is different. I mean, with Western countries, especially with Western countries, because if I talk about the Arab Gulf countries or the Arab countries, it's kind of similar. Especially Kuwait, they are and Lebanon, they are really different. How the parliament works, it's really different. Another parliament, they are more democracy. They really, I would say, the two parliaments in the Arab Gulf countries, and Arab countries.
Yes.
So in this case, we have I would say Kuwait because I know more about Kuwait. It's really similar to what they do. Not in the United States, but it's the big difference when I talk about Saudi Arabia.
Thank you so much. And I'm thinking about Molly's work. Where's Molly? She's very interested in Africa. Wouldn't it be interesting to look at some of the governments in Africa? There's so much. And if you want to do a PhD, come on, we'll run together. You could teach me a lot. That. One thing that's humbling about this is, Dr. Barrett knows this, she does this, I do this readily. It's okay to say I don't know, and I really don't know a lot about government systems around the world, and some of the early work that Lou's been doing, and I'm not going to ask you to do it because it's just preliminary, but you looked at China, and you looked at the UK, and I have to learn the systems, anybody, there's a quote in American politics. You know what sausage is? You know sausage. And the quote is, anyone who likes sausage or the law should never watch either one being made. So I'm trying very hard to just understand the public policy cycles here in the U.S., and I've got so much to learn. So thank you. Anyone else, please? Thanks.
If I can jump in. So I was curious to know how many of the press secretaries that you interviewed were hesitant to talk. Did everyone you approached say yes? Were there some people who said, absolutely, I'm not going to discuss this? And I'm curious about the comment you made about ethics, that you're representing someone even if you don't agree with their values or you don't agree with their policies. In the case of someone like Anthony Weiner, I don't know if you interviewed his press secretary, but someone like him who has been in a public scandal, how were their press secretaries still willing to represent them, and they were okay with it, or was there a real conflict at that point?
Great.
That's a great question.
That's a great question. I'll attack the second one. Can you just remind me of the first part?
The first one, if everyone was willing to talk.
Yeah, that one's easier. I'll share this with you. I was surprised when we got on the phone in 1983 and said, "Will you talk?" Very few. I can't think of one who wouldn't talk. Now, they were busy, and we'd have to set up a schedule, and a little bit hesitant, but that's funny. One said, and I can only paraphrase the quote, "No one cares about what I do, so I'm really glad to talk to you."
Okay.
I mean, in the human condition, we like to talk about ourselves, and I assume that that's cross cultures. I don't know. But in the U.S., we certainly do. And the press secretaries were very willing to speak. Now, I'll tell you something that's just on the horizon, which I'm noticing. This last round, I spoke to 6 of them last week, and I didn't know them, so I had a friend call his friend who called them for me and set it up. I don't know who turned it down. This is one of the first times this happened. I did get one person who wrote me the next day and said, in essence, "Make sure you don't refer to me this way, make sure you know this," and I think he's a high-strung, nervous guy to begin with. So there might be a little bit of shift, I'm not sure. And another thing is, they're hesitant to some degree. What they'll do is, this, Dr. Baird, maybe it's where you send out a survey that's a leading question where you get the response. They get these kind of things. So things have changed in new media, but I can tell you that based on my experience, the vast majority, if not all, were very willing to talk and were forthcoming when they did.
That's excellent.
Now, the second question about ethics is such a fascinating one because it really gets into the larger question, not about press secretaries, but it's illustrative of the role of public relations in the U.S., at least in our democracy. And the question there is that I think it's fascinating because what I do when I teach ethics, and for you guys have had to sit through this lecture, I'm sorry about this, but I say, to what or to whom belongs your ultimate value? And in the case of the press secretaries, the ultimate value is not their personal ethical framework. It is, in fact, the ethical framework of the member. So without hesitation, they're willing to do this. Now, we'll get to Wiener in just a minute, but if I back up for just a minute and we think about this, this is interesting. This is what they'll do. They'll always be with a member. So you say, well, it doesn't make sense. I can tell you this. There's only one press secretary I know of who was working for a member from another party. So she was an independent. The member was a Democrat. And it seems that most of the press secretaries, if the Republican is a moderate, they're probably most likely a moderate. Now, there have been some press secretaries who've jumped within the Republican Party, for example, from moderates to conservative. But it probably doesn't cause as much consternation. I oftentimes think things kind of even out a little bit. Because if 90% you can do what you believe in and promote something you believe in, and you're behind the cause that you believe in, and you're drawn to that kind of job, if 10% of your job means you have to go against it a little bit, as long as it's not a hot button issue, abortion, gay rights, the death penalty, they're usually okay with it. Now, the thing that can happen with this, and it can happen though, is that what you'll find occasionally, like if we took the example of, let's take the example of gay marriage. Okay. It would be very, very unusual if a press secretary were a conservative Republican would ever work for a Democrat who's pro-gay marriage or who's gay. But it wouldn't be unusual, perhaps, if the press secretary believed in gay marriage and the member of Congress, perhaps for political expediency, believed in civil unions. They both believe in gay rights, but there's a little bit of disjoint. Or in the case of military, should we withdraw our troops? One may say, the press secretary may think, withdraw them immediately. The member may say, again, perhaps for political expediency, let's withdraw them gradually. But they both want to withdraw them rather than build them up. Now, the third part of this is, am I doing okay?
Yeah.
Okay. In terms of Anthony Weiner, I so appreciate the question. I can tell you I didn't talk to his press secretary. But one thing I have to always be very careful of is I can never name the people I talk to. But this is what happens. There's a section in the book where I talk about this. It's like a bomb gets dropped. Because this guy, remember the guy who I was in the White House and he's been doing this forever? He's given his life to this guy. Well, if this guy does something terribly, terribly unethical, his life is ruined. Or as one said to me, my life became hell for. So you're talking about remember the scandal. I was like, good heavens. So, and then it's about God or something. But the point of the whole thing was that it was really interesting, and it's a blow to them. It's a big blow. Now, the question is, what happens when there's a member who's caught in a scandal? You survive scandals, scandals blow over, scandals reach a wave and then go down, other things happen. That seems to happen most of the time. But I don't know beyond that. I haven't spoken to one, at least in depth, about your member has been involved in a large national scandal of the magnitude of the Anthony Weiner scandal. How do you do? So I don't know beyond that. But my guess is they'd stick with them. I bet you anything.
There's a sense of loyalty.
Eddie, the example that comes to mind for me is not a congressional press secretary, but a White House press secretary, Mike McCurry.
Perfect.
If you, okay.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know if they're
Want me to
all
do it?
familiar with him, but why don't you explain what happened
Sure.
and what he did?
Yeah, well, Dr. Barrett, she has throughout my career, she set me up for a good pitch here. And we're talking about it's an easy ball to hit, so it's a good one. Now, Mike McCurry was President Bill Clinton's press secretary.
Right.
And when you ask people what comes to mind when you think of Bill Clinton, usually, you know what comes to mind when you think of Monica Lewinsky, yes? So the interesting thing about this was when we look at Clinton, I thought he was a brilliant politician, a brilliant mind, strong politically, was able to triangulate, very likable. Some folks with whom I've spoken have said he had the potential to be one of the great ones, and then the Lewinsky scandal struck. So that's a subjective opinion. But you can say objectively, in terms of likability, he scored very high. In terms of intelligence, he scored very high. In terms of much higher than Obama, for example.
Yes.
In terms of being able to triangulate, he was very high. And he's much more with the American people. He didn't try. Matter of fact, remember he tried health care. Hillary Clinton didn't work, and he pulled back. He didn't push it. So what happened was he was embroiled in this terrible, terrible Lewinsky scandal. And you may remember that he shook his finger at the camera and said, I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Monica Lewinsky. You see, his press secretary, and this is why it's such a good question, did something related to the scandal that's very, very difficult. Do you remember how I said you can't lie? So now what does he do? If he knows that Clinton did this, and the Bluegrass said he did, if he knows that he did it, he's going to have to lie. But if you lie, you can't be a source, you can't be trusted. So what else you could say is no comment, but as you know, that's not what you should say. You can't say no comment because that's red meat for reporters.
Right.
When you tell a reporter, I'm not going to tell you, what they hear, at least as I had it, is, oh, then I've got to look further. So what does he do? Well, what Mike McCurry did was something very interesting. He practiced something called plausible deniability. And what that means is that, at least as far as we know, he actually made a point of not knowing. So he could literally go before the media and say, I don't know. I know what the president said. So that's essentially how he had. Did I get that right? That's my sense.
But then eventually, when he did find out that Clinton had lied,
Oh, yeah.
and then Clinton lied under oath,
Right.
he quit.
He quit.
He said, this is it. I've had it. My credibility is shot. My ethics are now under question. So he did one of the hardest things anybody could ever do. To reach that level of being a White House press secretary, one of the most important jobs in PR in the whole world.
Yeah.
He gave it up.
Yeah.
He gave it all up. But he
That's
earned,
a great point, yeah.
but then he earned the respect of the people who are in the profession saying you did the right thing. And also he earned the respect of the journalists. He kept his own ethics intact.
Okay.
But it was a huge hit for him to take, because he was connected to the most powerful man in the world. And he gave it up because he wouldn't compromise his own ethics.
Dr. Barrett gives it. It's a great example how the story unfolds. You know, we saw a little brush up of that with President Obama when he said, if you like your health care plan, you can keep your health care plan.
Oh, right.
If you like your doctor, you can
Right.
keep your doctor. And you can go back, just do a little Google search, and you'll find that his own press secretary, Jay Carney, took some real heat.
Right.
Because I want to be very careful how I word this. I can say his critics suggested that he blatantly lied. But his supporters would have a different view of that. Makes sense to you? So I don't want to get into that because I don't really know. But I can feel for his press secretary, Jay Carney,
Right.
having to go out there when the media, perhaps the conservative media, is jumping on this story saying, he lied, he lied, he lied, he lied. And you've got to sort of go out there and you've got loads of tape and loads of video showing him saying this 24 times or something.
Right.
And then you've got to go before the camera and do it. It's a hard one.
And Jay Carney quit
Did he
too.
survive that? Okay, I don't.
He quit too.
Oh, he's still the press secretary, isn't he? I thought he did, but I'm not sure.
Oh my God.
But he had a really hard go. I'm so thank you for your question. Do we have time for a question?
Oh, yeah.
Please.
I have two questions that
Sure.
are not related. The first one is, do press secretaries, even at the congressional level, get paid enough to take those phone calls at 4 a.m. and kind of be their babysitter? They in it for the money as well. And then the second question is, have you seen any movies or TV shows that accurately depict the job of a press secretary?
Thanks for your question. Thank you very much. The first question about their pay, I looked at that data. I think the average is about $60,000. Now, don't quote me on that. I think that's about it. The point is that they're not paid well. It's notorious that congressional staff is not paid well. I was talking to one press secretary who's delighted to be leaving Capitol Hill. He's been up there. He's been doing fascinating, high exposure things. I saw a quote from him the other day on C-SPAN. He's really having a good time, but he's leaving to go make some more money. An interesting thing happens when they leave. You're not sure what happens to them because the job prepares you to do nothing, but everything. And you come from one of the most unique environments in all the world. There's very few people in the world who've ever been to Capitol Hill, much less worked on it, much less been a press secretary. So they like that. They're very grateful for the job. These quotations at the end were carefully chosen. I mean, I tried to find something interesting, but I also wanted to find something that I thought the data suggested were, in fact, accurate. This is really how I believe they feel. But no, they're not. They're not paid extremely well. Their offices are by no means glamorous. It's a bullpen-like atmosphere. They're relatively young. They're hungry, and there tend to be two types. One type is a political junkie who just can't wait to mix it up. Another is a communication professional who sees this as a wonderful opportunity, and most are a hybrid. Part communication professional, disproportionately they study journalism or public relations in undergrad, who also has an interest in politics. Now, to the second question, I'm so sorry, I had it and I lost it, I'm sorry.
Have you seen movies or TV shows?
Oh, I have to tell you, I haven't been good, because when they talk about House of Cards or Scandal, sorry, I should, I got on the
I've had House of Cards in mind. I didn't watch it diligently, but my husband did, so maybe I'll go back to it.
Well, your husband's much smarter than I am.
Oh, no, it's for pure entertainment.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
I mean, I've just seen snippets, and so I think somebody was telling me I should watch these, and I'm embarrassed. I haven't done my research.
It's just because it does, because they always say that, okay, watch this again.
Yeah, Lou, so I gotta watch it. I will say there's something about Scandal, though. Judy Smith,
Was it BU?
was it for you?
Yeah.
And I team taught it, of course.
The character in Scandal, how many of you have seen Scandal?
Oh, good! Oh, good! I'm so glad.
Okay, that character, it's on Thursday nights at 10 o'clock. And that character, her name is Olivia Pope in the TV series, is patterned after Judy
Smith, who
Smith.
taught
And
us.
Judy Smith was at BU for a semester when we were.
She
And
was.
she was teaching crisis communication.
She was.
Because that's what she did. And that was it. That was the end of it. 1 year was enough, right?
I think that 1 year was enough. She spoke to the communication students at graduation, and she said, I did not have a relationship with President Obama. I guess that's, so I'm sorry, but your husband's much smarter than I am.